Following the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, Cuba was directly governed by the United States military until 1902. During these years, Cubans held more public offices than they had under Spanish rule, and a lot was done for public works, sanitation, and education. The most important thing is that yellow fever was wiped out in places where it had been common for hundreds of years. From November 5, 1900 to February 21, 1901, a constitutional convention met in Havana. The U.S. made the Platt Amendment a requirement for Cuba to accept the Constitution, and Cuba agreed to it on June 12, 1901. By agreeing to these rules, Cuba promised not to take on debts that it couldn't pay back with its current income, to keep up the sanitation work started by the U.S. military government, to lease naval stations to the U.S., and, if necessary, to let the U.S. step in to protect Cuba's independence and a government that could keep people safe and protect property. In May 1902, Tomás Estrada Palma became the first president of the new republic, and during his time in office, some Cubans got better off financially. The government led by Estrada Palma tried to make changes for the better, but it was very unstable. His party, the Conservatives, later called Moderates, won the elections in December 1905, but the Liberals, who were in the other party, said that the government rigged the vote. In July 1906, there was a revolution because of this charge, as well as widespread pension fraud and the government's failure to make the changes that were called for. Estrada Palma quit his job, and on September 29, 1906, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt made William Howard Taft the new governor of Cuba. However, on January 28, 1909, the U.S. government stopped running the country, and the republic began again. From 1909 to 1925, Cuba had three presidents: José Miguel Gómez, Mario García Menecul, and Alfredo Zayas y Alfonso. During this time, the U.S. got involved in Cuba twice and threatened to get involved more than once. But by 1920, though, the country was in the middle of a serious financial crisis. Even though there was a moratorium, many banks and other businesses went out of business. In January 1923, the United States gave Zayas a loan of $50 million, and the economy got better quickly. But Zayas was accused of being corrupt more and more, and there were uprisings against him, led in part by war veterans. When Zayas tried to get his party to nominate him again, he ran into a lot of trouble. So he made a deal with General Gerardo Machado I. Morales, who was running as a liberal, to work against Menecul, who was running as a conservative in the 1924 election. Machado was thus elected with a lot of votes, and he started his job on May 20, 1925. He promised to change things, but during his first term, he only kept a few of those promises. In 1928, when he started his second term, a rule of terror began. Machado became Cuba's first dictatorial ruler, a position he held until 1933, when he was overthrown in a revolt headed by Fulgencio Batista, a rising star in the Cuban military. Despite the country's succession through several presidents, Batista somehow managed to maintain his power for the succeeding 2 decades. He was elected president in 1940, remained in that role until 1944, and then sought re-election in 1952. And at last, when he was about to lose the election, he staged a bloodless coup to overthrow the government and then cancel the voting. But this is where the story takes a turn. Castro, a young lawyer and activist, had been running for Congress as part of the Cuban People's Party before Batista gained control. On July 26, 1953, he conducted an attack upon the Montcat Army barracks in the city of Santiago de Cuba, with the goal being to arm a revolutionary opposition to the administration. The majority of the group was eliminated, but Castro and his younger brother Raul managed to flee, only to be captured and put behind bars later. The trial of Fidel Castro and his subsequent imprisonment contributed to the development of his reputation as a revolutionary leader. After Batista caved into international pressure and granted amnesty to a large number of political prisoners in 1955, Fidel Castro fled to Mexico, where he began organizing Cuban exiles into a movement named for the date of the failed attack on Moncada. The movement was named after the date of the failed attack. Grama, a small vessel that set sail for Mexico in November of 1956, carried 82 men who were representatives of the 26th of July movement. On December 2, 1956, Batista's soldiers attacked the revolutionaries shortly after they landed in a rural region of eastern Cuba. Batista's forces had advanced knowledge of the attack and had been planning it for some time. Even though the majority of the group was eliminated, there were perhaps 20 people who were able to flee, including Fidel and Raul Castro, as well as Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentinian, and one of Castro's international recruits. After reaching the Sierra Maestra highlands, Castro's squad recruited some additional members and launched a guerrilla fight against Batista's forces, which were better equipped and had a greater number of soldiers. For the subsequent 2 years, Cuba was in the midst of a de facto state of civil war. During this time, rebel forces carried out attacks on government facilities, sugar plantations, and other locations. Meanwhile, Batista's regime persecuted anyone who was suspected of working with Castro's revolution. As a response to the mounting opposition, Batista suspended constitutional safeguards for Cubans, including the freedom of speech and the ability to assemble freely. The year after that, he demanded that the scheduled election for president be put off, citing the continued violence as his justification for doing so. Batista issued a summons for a strong military operation against the rebels in the Sierra Maestra Mountains in the summer of 1958, and he did this mainly because he believed that support for the revolution was beginning to wane. Unfortunately for him, the rebels were able to quickly turn the offensive around, which forced the army to retreat. As the revolutionaries received good coverage from worldwide media outlets, even the United States began to withdraw its backing for Batista's administration, which it had previously supported because of the dictator's anti-communist attitude. Although a more moderate contender received a greater number of lawful votes, Batista's hand-picked successor won the Cuban presidential election, held in November 1958. Guevara's forces defeated a much larger army garrison in the Battle of Santa Clara and captured a train loaded with vital arms and ammunition in late December 1958, which was the decisive blow dealt by the revolutionaries of the 26th of July against Batista's regime. At the same time, the support for Batista continued to erode. Thus, at long last, on January 1, 1959, with rebel troops coming down on Havana, Batista escaped Cuba for the Dominican Republic. He eventually moved to Portugal, where he would stay in exile until he died in 1973. Fidel Castro arrived in Havana on January 9 to take the head of a new provisional government, quickly solidifying control and rounding up Batista's loyalists, many of whom were prosecuted and murdered by revolutionary courts. During the revolution, Fidel Castro advocated for the holding of elections. Yet, after he assumed power, he indefinitely postponed these elections. The United States was one of the first countries to recognize Castro's government in Cuba. However, relations between the two countries deteriorated rapidly after Castro established a communist regime in Cuba and forged close ties with the Soviet Union, which was an adversary of the United States during the Cold War. The United States severed diplomatic relations with Cuba in early 1961, and the next few years were marked by growing tensions, particularly the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro remained in power in Cuba until 2008, when he formally resigned after handing over power to his brother Raul Castro. This brings us to the end of this video. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.